Hello and welcome. Thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar today. We really hope you find it useful. My name is Haley Lampkin-Blythe, and I'm an attorney with the Education Law Program at Council for Children's Rights. So just a quick disclaimer before we get started. The information we're providing you today is for educational purposes only, so it is not legal advice. So what do we do? Before we jump into the content of this webinar, we wanted to share a little information about the Education Law Program in general. So the Education Law Program has four main focuses. First, through our Education Advocacy for Individual Families program, we provide individual representation for students and their legal guardians who are in need of legal assistance regarding special education, Section 504 plans, and school discipline issues. And so families interested in legal representation can contact us using our GET helpline. And you can see here our email address and phone number for our GET helpline for assistance. And then secondly, through our education navigation service, we work with students involved in the juvenile court system in Mecklenburg County. And the services address issues related to students' educational rights by identifying current education issues and providing detailed recommendations for how to resolve those concerns. So referrals to the Education Navigation Service can be made through our ELP email address listed here on the PowerPoint, or by calling the number listed on the PowerPoint as well. And then thirdly, we focus on systemic educational issues. So we know that we cannot individually serve all the students in our community who need our services, although we wish we could. And so instead, we try to strategically elevate issues that we know might have a broader impact on students in our community. And then lastly, we do free community trainings on topics related to education advocacy. In addition to this, our First Wednesday series, we also provide trainings to parent groups and community groups by request. So here's our agenda for today for the webinar. We'll go over some general preliminary information, and then we'll focus in on our top tips, which are listed here. So just two quick notes before we get started. We want to go over a few terms that we'll use throughout the presentation so that we're all on the same page. So first tip, special education, AKA. There are many acronyms that we use when we're discussing special education, and some terms mean the same thing. So we want you to understand that students who receive special education have an individualized education program, an IEP. They're also called exceptional children, or EC, but EC is a North Carolina specific term. So ultimately what we want you to know is that when we're talking about EC services, IEP services, or special education, we are talking about the same services and we will use those terms interchangeably. And the second note is about charter schools. So some families choose to send their students to charter schools instead of to a traditional public school district. But charter schools are public schools that are authorized by the State Board of Education, and they're operated by an independent nonprofit board of directors. And so everything we discuss in this training applies to charter schools as well as to traditional public schools, which means that charter schools must follow special education law, Section 504 law, and follow North Carolina law on school discipline. We mention this because too often we learn about situations where charter schools are telling families that they don't need to comply with these laws. So we want to make it clear that students have the same rights in charter schools that they do in public school districts. Okay, so next we're going to go over just an overview of the different types of education interventions. We like to do a brief overview to begin these trainings so everyone is aware of what they mean, what we mean when we talk about terms like IEPs and Section 504 plans. Okay, so this graphic helps us take a step back and understand what services are available to different groups of students. So the largest circle incorporates all students, whether or not they have a disability. So any student who is struggling academically or behaviorally in school can receive extra assistance. And in North Carolina, this assistance is through something called the Multi-Tiered System of Support, or MTSS. And you do not need a disability in order to be a student who receives support through MTSS. Then in order to fall into either of the smaller two circles, a student must have a qualifying disability. So the bigger of the two circles is Section 504. And as we'll learn a little more about, most students with disabilities fall under Section 504, more students with disabilities fall under Section 504 than under special education. So special education then is the smallest circle because it has the most stringent eligibility requirements. So the Multi-Tiered System of Support, or MTSS. As I mentioned before, MTSS is available to any student, whether or not they have a disability, and it's intended to provide extra support and interventions to students with additional needs. And then MTSS involves different tiers of support. So all students are considered to be on Tier 1, which means that all of those students have access to high quality instruction. And then at Tier 2, students with an identified academic or behavioral need receive some small group interventions as well. And then Tier 3 is the highest tier of MTSS, and at this tier, students receive more intensive individualized supports. So a little more about MTSS here. A key component of MTSS is the universal screening. And the purpose of this is to identify students who need supplemental support. So by the time the student gets to Tier 3, they should be receiving evidence-based interventions to respond to their specific needs. And progress monitoring should be a part of MTSS as well. And so this means that there are specific goals that interventions are intended to address, and that data is regularly taken to determine whether the students are making progress towards those goals. So families really should be aware when their student is on Tier 2 or Tier 3 of an MTSS plan and actively participate in the process. So there are generally meetings to review the student's progress, and the family should attend those meetings if they can, and ask for regular updates based on the progress monitoring data. And then the MTSS team can make a referral to special education if they believe that the student may qualify for an IEP. Which leads us to the question of who gets special education or an IEP. And so as a reminder, on the graphic a couple slides ago, special education was the smallest circle. And so for a student to receive special education services, the student must meet these criteria. So first, they must be between the ages of 3 and 21. And then they must meet the criteria for at least one of 14 disability eligibility categories. And so in North Carolina, each eligibility category has specific requirements that must be shown in order for a student to fall under that eligibility category. So for instance, a diagnosis of autism by itself does not necessarily mean that a student will automatically be eligible for an IEP under the autism eligibility category. They have to meet the specific eligibility requirements. And then the last criteria is that the disability has to have an adverse effect on their educational performance, and the student has to require specially designed instruction. And so I want to point out here that educational performance is broader than just academic performance. So a student can be advancing from grade to grade and have passing scores in their classes, but still be eligible for an IEP. And that's, part of that is educational performance also includes things like social interactions and the student's behavioral needs. Excuse me. And so here is a list of all 14 eligibility categories in North Carolina. So what is an IEP? IEP stands for Individualized Education Program, as I mentioned before. And the P in IEP stands for program. We always like to point that out, not plan, like a lot of people think. And that's because an IEP incorporates all the services that a student would receive. And the IEP document itself is very long. It's generally at least 15 pages and is very detailed. Some things that are included in the IEP document are the student's strengths, weaknesses, and needs, measurable goals for the student to achieve in the course of a year, the accommodations, related services, and specially designed instruction necessary to help the student reach their IEP goals, and then where the services will be provided. And so when I say where the services will be provided, this does not mean the actual physical location, such as Myers Park High School versus West Charlotte High School. Instead, what this refers to is whether the student will receive their services with their non-disabled peers, or instead, if they'll receive their services in a setting only with other students with disabilities. So for many students, it ends up being a combination of both, but that's what we mean when we say where the services will be provided. And then the IEP document is developed by an IEP team, which must include the special education decision maker. And most often, the special education decision maker is the student's parent, but can be other people depending on the circumstances. And then lastly, we just want to mention that all students are entitled to something called a free appropriate public education, or a FAPE. And really what you need to know is just that FAPE is a legal standard that requires all students' IEPs be appropriately ambitious and reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress in light of the student's circumstances. Okay. So we often receive questions about the difference between an IEP and a Section 504 plan. And as I've said, all students who receive special education services have an IEP. So students with IEPs receive some amount of specially designed instruction with a special education teacher. And what specially designed instruction is it's adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of the instruction to meet the unique needs of a student that results from the student's disabilities. Section 504 accommodation plans, however, are for students with disabilities whose needs do not rise to the level of requiring specially designed instruction from a special education teacher. So these students receive all their instruction in a regular education environment, and they receive their accommodations from a general education teacher that can implement them to allow the student to have access to their education. And then also, as we've mentioned before, Section 504 has a broader definition of disability. So more students qualify under Section 504 than qualify for special education. And then lastly, if a student has an IEP, they do not require a Section 504 plan, because everything that would be on the Section 504 plan could also be incorporated into the IEP. Okay, so we like to illustrate the difference between an IEP and a Section 504 plan with an example. So Sam has a specific learning disability, which is one of the 14 disability eligibility categories in North Carolina. And his IEP provides services with a special education teacher several times a week to address his individual goals in reading, writing, math, and organization. He also receives modified assignments, extended time on tests, and takes tests in a room with fewer students. On the other hand, Erin has severe myopia, which is nearsightedness. Her Section 504 plan requires seating near the teacher and the board, and that all printed materials be presented in a larger font. And so, as you can see, Erin does not have any special education services or any individual goals like Sam does. Also, SAM receives accommodations and modifications that, if those were needed, could be on a Section 504 plan. Those accommodations and modifications are assignments, extended time on tests, and taking tests in a separate setting. So all of those accommodations could be on an IEP. I'm sorry, on a Section 504 plan. So we also want to note some important similarities between IEPs and Section 504 plans. First, they're both required to be reviewed annually, and these meetings are generally called annual review meetings. And these are really very important meetings for families to attend. But while there's only one meeting required a year, families can request an IEP meeting or a Section 504 meeting at any time during the school year. And then lastly, IEP teams and Section 504 teams can spend hours and hours drafting a beautiful document, but if it's not actually implemented, then it's essentially worthless. So it's really critical for families to follow up with the teachers and make sure that the services, accommodations, and modifications are actually being provided as written. Okay, so now that we've gone over that general information, we'll move on to our main topic for today's webinar, and that's top tips for a successful start to the school year. And what we hope is that today's information can make you just feel a little more confident helping your student get off on the right foot this school year. Okay. So tip number one, learn relevant policies and procedures. So each school district will have the following resources available to you. There will be a parent and student handbook, and then a code of student conduct, Board of Education policies, and we'll walk through what each of these resources contain in the next couple of slides. These are important documents that should be available on the school district's website, but if you have trouble locating them, ask school staff where you can find them. And then also your student's individual school will have resources available to you. So be sure to review the school's website before the school year begins. And on the school's website, you'll generally find faculty and staff contact information, a calendar of school events, and then you'll also find often teacher-specific websites. So many teachers will create their own websites to provide updates to parents about what's going on in the classroom throughout the year. And many teachers will even post information about upcoming assignments that might be due in the student's class. And the school's website should also have the relevant documents and forms that you might need throughout the year. But again, if you can't find them on the website, you can go to the office and ask the main office for the forms. So we'll go through some of these resources a little bit more. So the parent-student handbook addresses topics like attendance. So this section will detail how many unexcused absences your student is allowed per year, as well as which absences are considered to be excused absences. And it's always best practice to go ahead and let the school know if you know your student will be absent. And then it also covers things like communication between families and schools, student services, their legal rights, school food services, school calendars, and graduation requirements. Okay, the Code of Student Conduct contains school rules and disciplinary procedures. So, for example, did you know that students may be disciplined for conduct that happens off of campus if it has a direct and immediate impact on the orderly and efficient operation of the schools or the safety of the individuals in the school environment? So that's an important thing to be aware of. And then unfortunately, if your student does receive a short-term suspension, which is a suspension of 10 days or less, there is no formal right to appeal a short-term suspension. However, you may request the opportunity for your student to be able to complete their assignments and make up tests while they're suspended. But if your student is suspended, make sure to review the suspension paperwork carefully to ensure that it aligns with the student code of conduct and that the district has followed all applicable policies and procedures. So like we mentioned before, we recommend getting familiar with your student's school website. You'll find here the contact information for the school's faculty and staff, the school calendar for the year. And then you should also be aware that each school in North Carolina has its own school report card from the state. It gives it a grade. So then the next set of policies we want you to be aware of relates to bullying. So of course, we hope that you will not need to be familiar with these policies, but in the event that you do, all schools are required to have a policy prohibiting bullying and harassment. So if your student is bullied at school, report the bullying in writing every single time it occurs, and in writing. And then be sure to keep a copy of those reports for your records. If your student has an IEP or a Section 504 plan and is being bullied, you should also request an IEP meeting or a Section 504 meeting to discuss whether anything with the student's services needs to be modified as a result of the bullying. And then it's also good to know that anyone who has knowledge of the bullying is required to report it. And so that includes teachers as well as other students. And if you want to know more about this topic, if it's a topic of interest to you, we do have a separate training that covers policies surrounding bullying in much more detail. So bus transportation. If your student is planning to ride the bus, you'll see the contact information here for the CMS Transportation Department. And then some school districts also use apps, like apps on your phone, so that you can track your student's bus. And the one CMS uses is called Here Comes the Bus. That's the name of the app. And then we just want to mention that it's possible for your student to be suspended from riding the bus. So if a student receives a bus suspension, that student is still allowed to attend school, but they cannot ride the bus to get there. So unfortunately, like short-term suspensions, there is no formal right to appeal a bus suspension. And then medication at school. So if your student needs to take medication while they're at school, it does require valid medical authorization. And a new authorization is required on the first day of every school year if there have been changes to the dosage of the medication, to the directions for administration of the medication, or if a new medication has been prescribed. And then importantly, the school must provide a safe and secure location for the medication to be properly stored, including refrigeration. And the school is also required to keep a log of all medication administered to the student. And then additionally, the student's medication must be taken in the presence of a designated school personnel unless the student is authorized to self-administer the medication. Self-administration of medication is granted in some limited circumstances. So for example, it may be allowed if the student has asthma and needs access to their inhaler, or if the student has diabetes or severe allergies, things like that. But misuse of the medication by the student may result in disciplinary action. So that's something to be aware of. And then if the student is participating in any school-sponsored activities like field trips, athletic events, off-site music performances, things like that. It's a good idea to put the student's medication needs on the permission slip every single time so that all the adult chaperones at any given activity are aware of the student's medication needs. All right, so tip number 2, introduce yourself. It's always a good idea, of course, to introduce yourself and the student to their teachers, as well as the support staff, and including front office staff and the bus driver. And it's best to do this at the first thing at the beginning of the school year to start off on the right foot. If you and the student establish a positive relationship with school staff at the beginning of the year, it'll be much easier to navigate if more challenging issues need to be addressed throughout the school year. So it's a good idea to exchange contact information with them and determine their preferred method of communication. So do they like to email, text, or would they prefer a phone call? And then if you can, we also recommend taking advantage of school events like open houses, back to school nights, and just become a familiar face and further establish relationships with your student's school team. And then one thing we like to suggest is to send kind of an introductory email to the school at the beginning of the school year. And in this email, you can address the student's strengths, also maybe his areas of needs, any issues you might anticipate arising, and then strategies that work for you managing those issues at home. And for students with more extensive needs, you may want to consider creating an All About Me book, and you'll see an example of this in the handouts from today's webinar. This helps to set your student and the teacher up for success by giving them all the information they might need about the student. And then always share copies of important documentation like IEPs, Section 504 plans, or even any recent outside evaluations that you think are relevant. Share those with the school team as soon as possible. Although I will note here that any recent evaluations, if there's any sensitive information, you can redact that information if you want before sending it to the school. And if your student has an IEP or a Section 504 plan and is moving to a new school this school year, it's a good idea to request an IEP meeting or a Section 504 meeting near the beginning of the school year to ensure that the student's team is up to speed on the student's unique strengths and needs. And in the same vein as introducing yourself, our third tip is to build positive relationships. So as we mentioned before, it's a great idea to establish positive relationships with school staff on the front end so that you and the school can work together to effectively help the student benefit and have a good school year. So with this goal in mind, small gestures go a really long way. Teachers have a hard job, we all know this, and a word or a note of thanks and appreciation can really make someone's day and lighten the load a little bit for teachers. So school staff also always appreciate help with classroom supplies if you have the financial means to do so. And then just in general, it's helpful to stay in regular communication with school staff so that your only interactions with them aren't in the context of quote unquote problem situations or when issues arise. So think of yourself as part of the larger school community. If you have the time, consider joining the school's parent-teacher organization, PTO, or try to attend field trips, school activities, or sports games. And just, keep in mind that you may not always agree with school staff, and you may need to make some requests of the school at times to help support your student. And those requests are much more warmly received when you and the school staff have a relationship that demonstrates that you are already invested in the school as well as in your student. And here are just some examples of activities you could participate in at your student's school, broken down by elementary school aged kids, middle school age, and high school age. And then down at the bottom, you'll note just most schools, regardless of your student's age, welcome help in the office, filing envelopes for school-wide mailings and proctoring tests, things like that. And we do, of course, want to note that we understand that families are extremely busy, especially these days, and don't often have extra free time. So finding a little time to try to help out at the school once every few months will do a lot to make you feel part of the school community. Tip number 4 is communicate effectively. So we know that most of these things go without saying, right? But at the same time, we also recognize that school issues can really be very emotional. And it is really easy in those situations to kind of let your emotions get the best of you when situations get tense. And so, with that in mind, we just say that try your best to be respectful to school staff, even when you disagree with their recommendations. Um, and then also share your concerns and perspectives on your student. You are the expert on your student after all, but also be open and listen to the perspective of your students, teachers, and other school professionals. School staff will likely have valuable insights that you've not thought of, or they may have witnessed things in the school environment that don't occur at home, and so they can have really valuable insights and important information. And then try to maintain appropriate emotions, even when things get tense and when you get frustrated. But this doesn't mean you can't show any emotions. It's an emotional thing. We want you to recognize that when you need to take a break, when things get tense, recognize when you need to take a break when things get tense, or take some time to collect yourself before responding to an email you find upsetting, or even if you need to take a pause from an IEP meeting, do so you can collect yourself before moving forward with the meeting. And then also before a conversation or with school staff or a meeting, really think about what you hope to accomplish from the conversation and prepare relevant questions ahead of time. Okay, and then this is a big one. We say this really in almost every single one of our trainings because we can't stress it enough. Put all your communications with the school in writing. So either via letter or via email. Definitely put all requests for meetings, services, school records in writing, and document any concerns you have in writing. And even if you have a phone call with a school staff person, we always recommend following up that phone call with an email that summarizes the conversation. So, for example, per our phone conversation, my understanding is XYZ. And you can think of this as kind of a follow-up thank you email. It gives you a reason to send a written communication, but it also allows you a chance to put important information about that phone call in writing, and then it becomes part of the student's school record. And then keep a copy of all written communications for your own personal record as well. We will talk about this more in a future tip, but think through how you are keeping track of these communications, including emails. And then we just wanted to point out that you can find some helpful tips on letter writing at writeslaw.com. And then also just to mention that if an issue comes up with your student, we recommend starting with the lowest appropriate level. That's usually starting with the teacher, and then working your way up the chain of command if necessary, if the issue is not resolved. So that's all to say, if there's a problem, don't go directly to the superintendent with it. If you do, then you're likely to be told to go back to the individual school. And at that point, you're likely to have upset the people who are, actually making decisions for your student on a day-to-day basis. So start with the teacher and then only escalate the issue as needed. Our fifth tip is to understand the student's progress. So this one is really incredibly important. You need to understand what the data says about the student and their strengths and needs. And then be aware and seek out regular reports about your student's progress. The school should be providing you with regular class progress reports, as well as quarterly report cards and IEP progress reports if your student has an IEP. If your student has an IEP, expect an IEP progress report with each report card. And if you don't get one, follow up with your student's EC case manager. And then also be active online. So most school districts utilize the PowerSchool parent portal, and it will house all your students' current grades, their attendance, their class schedule, and their assignments. And it's available online on the computer, or there is a smartphone app as well. Teachers don't often send home regular class progress reports like they used to, because now this information is available on PowerSchool whenever you want to review it. But of course, the big caveat with PowerPoint is that it's only accurate if the teacher updates it consistently, and not all teachers put in data the same way or on the same time frame. So PowerSchool alone really only gives a fractional understanding of the student's academic life, and you should really just use it as a prompt for when you may want to speak with the teacher or with your student. And then, as we mentioned before, the school's website is also a good source of information. And then some teachers also utilize smartphone apps like ClassDojo or Remind. So at the beginning of the school year, find out from the teacher if they use any of these apps that you can access to see information about academics or behavior progress in the class. Okay, and more about understanding your students' progress. So schools rely heavily on data to measure the students' performance. And so here are some examples of important data or metrics to be aware of. So as we've mentioned briefly before, students with IEPs have annual goals, and each annual goal spells out how progress will be tracked, and the school must keep that progress monitoring data. So here's an example of an annual IEP goal. When given a grade level text, Sam will use learned strategies to determine the meaning of unknown words on 2 out of 3 opportunities. And then there's also daily point sheets. So some students with or without IEP might receive daily point sheets. And for example, one might say, Sam earned 6 out of 10 possible points today. He completed all of his work with some prompting and did not remain in the assigned area and became upset when the teacher attempted to redirect. And then another important metric to be aware of are MAP scores, but we'll discuss these in a little more detail in a little bit. But understanding these data points are critical to effective advocacy for the student. And if you're unsure how to interpret this data and information, ask questions. It's always good to ask questions and be engaged. So as I mentioned in the last slide, we're talking a little bit more about MAP testing. MAP stands for Measures of Academic Progress. So MAP tests are administered in CMS they're administered in CMS elementary and middle schools 3 times per year at the beginning, middle, and end of the school year. And what MAP tests do is they assess current academic ability in reading and math. They are computer adaptive tests, which means that the selection of questions is unique to the student, and it gets harder or easier based on the student's responses to the question. So for example, if a student answers question 4 incorrectly, then question 5 will be easier than if they had answered question 4 correctly. So it will modify based on the student's responses. And MAP scores can tell you whether the student is below, above, or on grade level. And it can also tell you how they're doing, excuse me, compared to their peers in the school district, and also compared to their peers nationally. And we like to use MAP scores to establish trends over time, rather than putting a significant amount of weight on any single score. So really looking at them at each benchmark and tracking it over time. And then foundationally, it's important to understand where the student is in relation to their peers and in relation to grade level expectations. But after that, really the important questions you're asking or you're thinking about with MAP scores is the student progressing relative to their own standards? And then is the student progressing at a meaningful rate? So just a bit more on map testing. The score, the RIT, signifies the student's current level of academic ability, and the teacher can use that score to personalize the student's curriculum. And then the student's scores are compared over time to measure the student's progress. So keep track of the student's scores and compare them to the student's expected progress and to the norm grade level mean. And then in the chart on the slide, you'll see the student scores. The student scores are in blue. The orange is the district grade level mean for the RIT, and the yellow is the norm grade level mean, which comes from the national scores. So you can see that this student is performing well below the average scores for the district and below nationally. You'll also see that the student scores do not seem to be increasing over time. So that's paying attention to that trend for the student. So then here's some other assessments. So Amplify Education Incorporated and M-Class are required by the state to assess reading fluency and comprehension for kindergarten through 3rd grade students. And similar to MAP tests, they're administered 3 times per school year during those grades, and it's during the beginning of the year in September, during the middle of the year in January, and then during the end of the year in May. And the exact assessment components depend and vary based on grade level. But some schools do choose to use this assessment even past the 3rd grade. So if you have a 4th or a 5th grader, you should ask the teacher if they continue with this assessment program in those grades at that particular school. So on this slide, we're just going to discuss the text reading comprehension, the TRC component of the M-Class in a bit more detail. So on this assessment, the student reads a passage out loud and then answers a question in writing or orally. And then the student's scores are labeled as either frustration, independent, or instructional based on the responses to questions and miscues to the read aloud. And then students are scored along the Fountas and Pinnell guided reading level of A through Z. And we'll discuss that a little bit more on the next slide. So, but just so you know, students at level A through E are also tested on sight word recognition. Okay, so a bit more on Fountas and Pinnell reading levels. Fountas and Pinnell reading levels help select books for reading instruction based on the student's reading level. And so you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, the text level gradient from A to Z. And then a student's performance is labeled as either green, which means they're at or above the benchmark, yellow, which means somewhat below benchmark and requiring some intervention, or red, which means well below benchmark and requiring intensive intervention. And it's important to know your student's level compared to the grade level expectation, because if the student is far below grade level, they should be receiving reading interventions and progress monitoring by the school, which involves more frequent assessments of the student's level. And then another tip for understanding your student's progress is that if you can, spend some time supporting the student with their homework if your schedule allows. We understand that this is a privilege that not everyone has time for. But if you do have the time, this will really help you understand the skills that the student is expected to display and help you learn about the student's areas of strength and weakness. And then also gives you you can then have information to inform the teacher of any learning issues you observe during homework time. Okay, so tip number 6, organize important paperwork. So this is really important. It doesn't matter what system you use to track the important documents, but you should develop a system of some kind. So keep all your documents in one location, organize them by academic year, and include the documents that we've listed here on the chart on this slide. And in addition to physical documents, you can create a folder in your email where you put important email communications related to the student. And one of the hardest things to organize can be text messages. So if you're having important communications with the student's teacher by text, then you may want to take a screenshot of those messages and keep those screenshots all in one place. So save them in a folder on your phone or a folder on your computer, something like that. Excuse me. So tip number 7 is to keep the school in the loop. So we say, inform the school about life events that may be impacting the student's performance, such as death of a loved one, divorce or separation, illness, moves or changes in living circumstances, or changes in outside services, such as therapy or counseling, and then changes in medication as well. And we say this because if the school is aware of these changes, then they can more easily help the student navigate the changes, and they won't be as surprised if the student exhibits maybe some behavioral challenges or changes during these life transitions. And then also during these times, it's more important than ever to have an open dialogue with your student's school about what's going on at home for your student. And we mentioned this a little bit before, but also provide the school with new outside evaluations, but feel free to redact those evaluations if they contain sensitive, confidential information that you would prefer that the school does not know about. And that can be as simple as just, taking a black Sharpie to redact the information. If the student receives a new outside evaluation, consider requesting an IEP or a Section 504 meeting if applicable. The new evaluation may contain information that means the student's services should change in some way. So that's important for the teams to know. But if the student does not have an IEP or a Section 504 plan, but receives an evaluation that indicates that the student may need one of those supports, share it with the school along with a request to evaluate the student for eligibility under special education or under Section 504. Tip number 8 is a big one. So trust your gut and advocate. We've said this before, but we can't emphasize it enough. You are the expert on your student, and you're the student's best advocate. So if you have a question or concern about the student, reach out to the school proactively. Don't wait for the school to call you with an issue or wait until your scheduled parent-teacher conference. Be proactive and reach out to the school on the front end. And then request an IEP meeting or, request an IEP or a Section 504 plan if there's a lack of expected progress towards the student's IEP goals. You obtain information from a new evaluation or reevaluation. I'm sorry if you could hear my dog barking in the background. Or you observe new or increased concerning behaviors. Tip number 9, encourage academic growth at home. So our final tip is to encourage academic growth at home. All areas of the student's life will impact their experience at school. We know that. And so while this webinar has largely focused on the importance of the caregiver becoming part of the school environment to help support the student, it's also equally important for the caregivers to make school a part of the home environment. So the next couple slides have some ideas about how to accomplish this. So here are a couple suggestions to encourage academic growth at home for elementary age students. The first one is sign up for a library card and help the student find books that they're excited about reading. We love when kids are excited about reading. And then read to them early and often. So for younger aged elementary students, have them look at the pictures and guess what the words might say. And for older elementary age students, ask them some reading comprehension questions like, what just happened on that page? Or alternate reading pages with them. So you read a page and then have the student read the next page. And then turn everyday tasks into learning opportunities. So for example, practice following directions by baking or cooking together. And this also provides older students with an opportunity to practice measurements, which helps, of course, with their math skills. And then remember that learning doesn't have to be a formal or planned activity. It can happen anywhere at any time. So a trip to the grocery store can be a great time to incorporate reading and math skills. As you walk through the store, you can talk about what words you see. You can discuss how much things cost and how to stay within a budget. And these practical applications of these basic skills can be really helpful now and also helpful for the student in the future. I really apologize about my dog. For middle school age students, help the student develop an organizational system to keep track of papers, assignments, and notes. This is one of the most important skills a middle school student needs to develop prior to entering high school. And then check in regularly on homework and projects. Projects require, of course, more long-term planning, so helping the student develop time management skills is really critical. And then I know this one's easier said than done with middle school age students, but ask more than how was your day. Instead, ask some questions that require more thought from the student that the student can't just answer with one word yes or no answers. So for example, what's one thing you learned today that you think you could use in the future? How would you use it? And if necessary, prompt a response from the student by sharing an example from your own experience. That can be helpful. And then for high school age students, find an appropriate balance between independence and accountability. Allow them room to be and feel challenged within reason, of course, and make time for regular check-ins and be proactive in engaging external resources such as after-school study sessions or subject-specific tutoring, etc. And then help the student make the connection between academic and practical skills. So for example, to connect skills they're learning in English class, maybe you could help them draft a resume and a cover letter for a potential job. And to practice practical math skills, you could talk about finances and help create a sample budget. And then be an active partner with the student to develop their post-high school plans. So ask the student if they have long-term goals for after high school. Are they interested in pursuing further education or starting a career? Ask what they want to do with their future and what problems they want to solve. And then linked in this PowerPoint is the College Foundation of North Carolina College Planning Timeline, which may be a helpful resource for the student. So we hope that the information provided today has been helpful. And if you believe that you may need legal representation related to Section 504, special education, or school discipline issues, you can contact our team here, as we mentioned before. The email is gethelp@cfcrights.org or call us at 704-943-9609. And for court-involved youth, members of the Child and Family Team or a student's juvenile defense attorney can make a referral to our Education Navigation Services by emailing elp@cfcrights.org or by calling 704-943-9611. And then for training requests, please, you can also contact us at that ELP email address, elp@cfcrights.org, or give us a call at 704-372-7961. And then here we've provided some links for helpful resources, and then also be sure to review the handouts for this presentation. And we thank you again for watching.